So next up is Toby Wise. Toby is a postdoctoral fellow that is managing to do something very challenging, as he's like split between University College London and the California Institute of Technology. And in these times, that must be particularly challenging. Yep. And he's working on aversive learning and its relevance to psychiatry, essentially. And today he'll talk about task state reactivation during active learning and avoidance. So please, Toby.
Okay, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you about a study that we've conducted regarding task state reactivation during aversive learning and avoidance, which was conducted at UCL with Yunze Liu, Fatima Chowdhury, and Murray Dolan. So that's my slide. So avoiding threat is really a fundamental survival skill. We wouldn't have made it as far as we have as a species if we weren't able to avoid threats to our safety. And on the flip side, as much as it might be helpful in helping us survive, these processes that help us avoid threat are thought to be important in many mental health problems such as anxiety and depression. So the questions that I want to understand are, how do we make plans that help us avoid threat? And how do we learn which kind of states in our environment which might be safe and which ones might be dangerous? If we understand these basic processes, how they function in health, we might be able to then later understand how they go wrong in disorders. So one mechanism that's been proposed to support learning and planning is memory reactivation. And there have been a few studies using MEG and fMRI in humans showing that, for example, that state reactivations might be reactivated when people are trying to make decisions to seek reward. And this is kind of echoing work in rodents, showing that hippocampal place cells tend to reactivate when rodents are making kind of spatial navigation decisions, including those aiming for reward. So this kind of suggests that maybe the brain is simulating the outcomes of its actions, states it might reach when trying to make these reward-guided decisions. However, this kind of reactivation process, this simulation process, has received very little attention in the aversive domain. And this is quite important because many of the symptoms that we think of as being important for anxiety and depression are related to kind of simulation of negative outcomes. So this kind of worrying and rumination often revolves around people simulating bad things that might happen to them. So the question I wanted to ask in the study was whether reactivation supports learning and planning in the aversive domain. To do this, I created this task, which we scanned using MEG. It's a bit complicated, but I'll try to give you a brief overview of the main kind of goal. Essentially, subjects started in one of a few start states and had to navigate their way through this kind of double Y-shaped maze to a goal state at the end. It's M or N node. Once they reached that goal state, there was a certain probability of getting an electric shock, which they had to learn and which fluctuated throughout the task. So their aim was basically to navigate kind of downwards along this tree to end up at the goal state that gave them the best outcome. Now, critically, on some trials, they started off in this sort of middle two arms, beginning B or C, and they just took the straight path down to the goal state. That's quite straightforward. In other trials, they started off at A or D, which we refer to as generalization arms of the maze. In these ones, they selected the path they wanted to go down, but they didn't actually see the final outcome they reached. So they had to kind of infer that starting off from A or D will result in going to M or N. So this means that they have to use some sort of model-based inference to figure out where they're going to get to in the outcome they will receive, rather than be able to directly learn it. So this allowed us to look at whether this kind of reactivation process might be specifically associated with model-based inference as opposed to model-free learning from experience. So in terms of behavior, we used some computational modeling, which I don't really have time to go into, to show that subjects were indeed using model-based inference to help them avoid shocks. And from the model we used to determine this, we got this parameter, which we call the generalization parameter, which basically represents how much they're using model-based inference to guide their behavior on those trials that required that kind of model-based inference. At the neural level, we use an approach that we refer to as temporal generalization to see whether state representations were being reactivated during decision making. So what this process involves is we first, before subjects see the task at all, we give them what we call a functional localizer task. This just involves showing lots and lots of images to them over and over again. And by doing this, we can then train a machine learning based classifier to detect the perceptual representations of those stimuli, mostly in visual cortex, when they're presented. What this means is that we can then reapply this classifier to the task, and critically, the states in our task are represented by the same images that we used in that functional localizer task. So if this classifier, for example, has been trained to differentiate between butterflies and marbles, if we then apply it to the task itself, we will get these probabilistic predictions out of it, and it might be saying, okay, at this point in the task, it looks like a butterfly is present in the signal. In this case, we can infer that the subject is then kind of reactivating the representation of that butterfly state. So this allows us to link the neural reactivation to behavior, because we could, like I said, we can use the classifier trained on those state representations to predict whether people are choosing one option versus the other. So if we ask our classifier to predict what it thinks it's seeing, if that prediction lines up with what they choose, we can assume that this kind of reactivation that we're seeing is linked to what they subsequently choose. What we saw is that when subjects are making decisions, they do indeed reactivate the kind of goal state that they are aiming to get to. And the extent to which they do this is correlated with the parameter from our computational model that represents how much they're using model-based inference. So what this means is that subjects who are using that kind of model-based inference are reactivating the goal state that they're trying to get to when they're making decisions. Subjects who aren't using that strategy are not doing that so much. So here this means that we can link the amount of reactivation we see at the neural level to the kind of behavior that we're seeing in subjects' decisions. And this was present quite strongly throughout the entire kind of 6 seconds they had to make a decision. And it was a kind of late component of the stimulus representation that we saw reactivated, peaking around 560 milliseconds. We also did this at the end of the task. So once they reached that goal state, they received an outcome, which might be a kind of indication of a shock or an absence of a shock. We had told them that they actually received the shocks late at a later stage after they've completed the task, just so we can avoid any kind of contamination by the shock itself. And what we saw was quite interesting there, because after subjects received that outcome, we saw evidence that the alternative goal state that they could have chosen was reactivated. So they might have chosen the state M, and after they received that outcome, they reactivated state N, the other one they could have chosen. So this might be a process that potentially supports some kind of counterfactual updating after receiving an outcome. When I first saw this result, I thought maybe I just got things flipped around, but it turns out that's not the case. So this shows the entire time course. So when they see the outcome, the kind of goal state they get to, you see that the classifier is picking up on that perfectly. Then they receive the outcome a little later on, and subsequently we see this reactivation of the alternative state that they could have chosen. What we then wanted to do was look at whether we could use source localization methods to identify where in the brain might be supporting this reactivation process. And what we did here was we essentially used beamforming to get time series of activation across the entire brain, and then predicted the strength of this. Sorry, I should say we then took those time series and used I can't remember what I'm saying. We then took those time courses and decomposed them to detect the level of theta power that was present in those time series. So essentially, theta has been heavily implicated in many of these decision-making processes that we're interested in. It's been related to reactivation of environmental states in rodents. So we wanted to focus on whether theta power is related to the extent of reactivation we see. So we were then able to take that theta power time series and predict it from the amount of state reactivation that we were seeing. It sounds a bit backwards, but that's there were reasons for doing it that way. So essentially what we're trying to see is whether the amount of theta power we see is related to the amount of reactivation we see. And this turned out to be the case. So this is at the outcome phase. So our subjects have received an outcome, and we see that around half a second, in this cluster here, around half a second after they receive the outcome. Theta power is significantly associated with the amount of reactivation we're seeing in this cluster that kind of encompasses areas of the medial temporal lobe, so the amygdala, hippocampus, parts of the medial frontal cortex. As it's MEG, we can't be too specific about the exact locations we're seeing, but those broad areas seem to be associated with the amount of reactivation that we're seeing. We also performed this in the planning phase. I'm not going to show you the data here, and we saw a similar kind of pattern there where theta power in the medial temporal lobe predicts the amount of reactivation we saw when subjects were making those decisions. So in summary, we saw that state reactivation seemed to be involved in this kind of avoidance process and learning about aversive value, and that this reactivation seemed to be supported by the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the PFC. In terms of implications, I think this really emphasizes the importance of reactivation in avoiding threat. We've seen a lot of work tackling this question in the reward domain, but this shows that it's also important in avoidance. And also suggests that the kind of computational models that we use to understand how people avoid threats might benefit from some kind of incorporation of replay. There's a lot of work in AI looking at how replay might support decision-making and planning. And it'd be interesting to adapt those kind of models to understand how people avoid threat. So I just want to thank Yunze, Fatima, and Ray, as well as Helen Schmidt and Daniel Bates, who helped with data collection. And thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Toby. So please put in the questions in the chat, and while people do so, I have a question, and I apologize in advance that I might have missed that. So all your analyses you do on the time series directly, is that correct?
Yes.
So why that choice, and why not? Because we know that MEG measures oscillations, and that particular frequency bands, as you mentioned at the end with the theta band, might carry different types of information. So a lot of people essentially do, as you probably know, the time frequency decomposition first before doing analysis. So I was wondering whether you've tried that, and or what you would predict would happen there, or
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So essentially, the way we're doing this analysis is kind of a little bit weird compared to how you would typically use MEG or EEG, because we mainly care about these kind of state reactivations, just seeing these kind of neural representations kind of appearing. We don't necessarily care about where they're happening, either in time or space. So the idea is basically we just want to give these classifiers as much information as we possibly can. They can then use that to detect this reactivation process. So yeah, we're kind of going into it just saying we don't really care. It could be anywhere. Tell us what's happening, rather than having any kind of specific hypotheses about the frequency bands.
Do you have Tyler? Did you have a question?
Yeah. So this reminds me a lot of working memory, that somehow a representation is being maintained over a delay. And I know within like the literature on working memory, there's still some debate about whether the representations are being reactivated in sensory areas, or if they're somehow also held in these prefrontal cortex and things like that. And so I guess the question of where the reactivation is happening is interesting in that sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting question here, because so when we look at the kind of sensors that are contributing most to the classification of these states, it's pretty much all occipital. It's all very visual cortex. So it seems like these representations are being reactivated in more perceptual areas. But then when we do that source localization, where we're predicting the strength of that reactivation from stuff around the brain, it seems that we get these more kind of medial temporal lobe, prefrontal perhaps areas. So essentially, it seems like maybe there's some kind of representation going on there, but then once that is reactivated, it leads to this kind of perceptual representation in the visual cortex being reactivated. So yeah, probably a bit of both, I guess.
Great. Are there other questions? I was just wondering, maybe very briefly. So when you look at your machine learning model, in particular the different states associated with the different events, can you map those onto the brain? Have you tried that?
In terms of sort of source localizing,
of course, yeah.
So they, I mean, do you mean like the distinct states having different kind of? I don't think, I'm not trying to do it. I'm not sure whether we'd see any differences across stimuli. Like I said, it seems like everything is basically somewhere in the visual cortex. I don't know whether we can really get much more specific than that using MEG. So it might be the sort of thing that might be more achievable with fMRI or something.
I mean, if the classifier picks up on it, you would think that there is differences that could be seen in the source as well.
Yeah, but it may well be that it's not kind of the location of them, it's the sort of pattern within that location. The other thing is we use like 100 milliseconds or something, about 100 millisecond window. So it's also the temporal profile that's going into that classification as well. So it's both temporal and spatial.
Cool. Thank you so much, Toby.
Thank you.
We should move on. So last speaker.